Okie dokie. We're back for our third installment in our agriculture unit. So far, what we've discussed is basic human nutritional needs, world food problems, how we've gone about increasing crop yields to avoid that Malthusian catastrophe we talked about, so those green revolution phases. And we talked a lot about livestock production, how we go about feeding livestock and the whole antibiotics debacle involved with that. Okay. This lecture will focus mostly in on pros and perceived cons of genetic engineering, the primary environmental impacts of agriculture. We'll talk about sustainable agriculture, and then a bit about fisheries and aquaculture. All right. So we'll just jump right in here to genetic engineering. So we did talk a little bit already about the potential uses of genetic engineering. All right. So making things more nutritious, increasing yields, making it so they don't need as much water or as much fertilizer or as much pesticides. So all kinds of potential there. All right. So just real quick, what is actually happening in the process of genetic engineering? Okay, it's not the same thing as selective breeding, where you're just taking traits that are already within a population. Okay, it is a process of actually taking DNA from another organism. So, like, let's say we have a bacteria that produces a toxin. All right, we can take that gene from that bacteria that allows it to produce that toxin and put it something like in a tomato plant, so that as the tomato plant grows, it produces that toxin and thus its own pesticide, and it greatly reduces the amount of chemical pesticides we have to apply. Okay, so that's one example, but it's an actual trait from another organism that we splice into an existing organism. Another thing worth pointing out is we can't actually create genes, at least not with our current technology. We have to use the genes that already exist in nature. So we cannot just throw together a sequence of DNA and create some trait that we want that maybe doesn't exist in nature. We have to work with what nature provides with us. It's already part of the DNA code of something else. Then maybe we can splice that in. But at least to date, we don't have enough knowledge about nucleotide sequences to actually create a desired trait that doesn't exist in nature. All right. So issues with genetically modified organisms or genetically engineered organisms. So to date, all research says that GMOs are perfectly safe for human consumption. Now, this being a relatively new technology, some people might say the jury's out, but there's been a lot of studies, and there's been zero health concerns associated with genetic modification. Okay, there are some concerns about GMO seed or pollen spreading into the wild, and you guys saw in the Food Inc. film about how we get cross-contamination. So let's say a farmer doesn't want GMOs. Sometimes that pollen spreads in anyways, despite the farmer's desire not to have GMOs. So we're not entirely sure how that might play out in natural ecosystems. Okay, so there's been this sort of a backlash against GMOs, partly because people are a little bit uncertain about it. Now, as a science guy, right, I would say that a lot of those concerns are not warranted. The data, the evidence is there, so these are perfectly safe, and in fact, the benefits of and potential benefits of GMOs probably far outweigh the potential scares. Okay, but on the same token, with all the intricacies of ecosystems, do we really know exactly how this genetic modification might play out if it comes to the wild? I would say we can't really say that for sure. Just that to date, we're looking at 20 years of genetically modified organisms existing. I think 1996 was when the first seeds became available. We have yet to see any major disruption whatsoever. In fact, mostly just benefits. All right. And probably the other controversy surrounding GMOs is some people just like them to be labeled, much like we label the calorie content, much like we label whether or not foods contain Trans fats, some people would like for there just to be a label that this food contains genetically modified DNA or something like that. Okay, there's the industry doesn't like that. The FDA found that it'd be counterproductive because there really are zero health concerns. There are health concerns with trans fats. There are health concerns with calories and sugars. There really aren't any with GMOs. All right. So moving on. So we spent some time talking about what industrialized agriculture looks like. We're going to talk a little bit about just some of the environmental impacts of such. Okay. One of which, and this is not necessarily just industrialized agriculture, but it's just land degradation. So going back to that idea, desertification, soil erosion, stuff we talked about. That's a big issue with agriculture. Okay. Habitat fragmentation. So when we convert grasslands or prairie or forests over to agriculture, right, we are breaking up the native habitat and disrupting it. Streams, all right, and so we have these expansive areas with heavy use of chemicals and animal waste and crop wastes. All those things contribute to agriculture being the number one contributor to water pollution, right? And chapter 20, I think it is, we will discuss that a little bit more, okay? Now, moving on. So how can we go about still producing foods in the varieties we need and the amounts we need, with at least trying to reduce a lot of those environmental costs we just talked about? Now, the habitat fragmentation piece is going to be difficult to overcome, but maybe some of the water pollution and land degradation issues we can deal with, all right? So in terms of pesticide use, okay, we can go about using natural predator-prey relationships instead of spraying pesticides. So introducing things like ladybugs and mantises, which are insect predators. They're insects themselves. They're insects that eat insects, can go a long way for us, okay? We can also pick certain different types of crops, okay? So, the crop rotation, which we'll talk about briefly, and we've already talked about before, is important, but just not having monocultures, all right? That helps to control pest populations in and of itself, because often pests targets particular plants they really like. And so if you have a wide variety of crops on a field, that in and of itself helps control pest populations. It also helps control nutrient depletion, because different plants kind of require different quantities of different nutrients, right? And so we can slow that erosion process by selecting the right crops. Crop rotation and conservation tillage, we've already talked about that in detail. Hopefully you guys remember what that is. And then using things like legumes, which would be peas, soybeans, etc., which will naturally have a symbiotic relationship with certain fungus and bacteria that help increase the nitrogen in soil. All right? And then making use of at least some organic agriculture. Okay? So, quick differentiation here is sustainable agriculture is not synonymous with organic agriculture. Organic is really strict in terms of you cannot use fertilizer and pesticides, at least not synthetic fertilizers and pesticides. I should make that clear. But you also cannot use genetically modified seed under the organic label. So if it's a certified organic agriculture, that means that they're not using chemical fertilizers. They'll use things like compost and manure. They're not using synthetic pesticides, but they might use minerals like copper sulfate, which can kill off certain fungus and stuff like that. Okay? Sustainable agriculture just tries to limit the use of fertilizer and pesticides. And that's because in the right quantities, they really have very small, if any, environmental impacts. Sustainable agriculture just tries to prevent the overuse of those things. Okay? And we will talk more about this integrated pest management in a later lesson when we get to the chapter on pesticides specifically. But it's kind of getting the best of both worlds. We use insect predators where we can. We make use of a lot of these processes and then judiciously use pesticides in addition to those. All right? So a sustainable agriculture system, so this little diagram is sort of an idealized system. So what I want you to notice, we have a mixture of food production, right? We've got fruit trees, we've got things like corn, strawberries, etc. So lots of different types of plants. We do have some agroforestry going on there, okay, and some animals. So if you think about this, it resembles what we often picture when you think about a pastoral farm, right? You're thinking, lots of different animals and livestock, lots of different types of plants growing. Lots of us, even though most of the reality of farming nowadays is monocultures, lots of us, when we picture a farm, we picture this, all right, which is a much more sustainable system for the reasons we just listed before. Okay. Now, the last part of chapter 19 on agriculture here is the fact that we also get a lot of our food from the ocean. Okay, so there's lots of pros to getting our food from the ocean. First of all, we don't need to farm the ocean, right? We don't have to cultivate and plow. We don't have to fertilize. We don't have to spray pesticides. Okay, we just go out and we fish for it. All right, so the input required to get food out of the ocean is much smaller than what's required to get food out of soil. Okay, because nature just kind of takes care of it for that. And a lot of our seafood is actually a really high quality protein. And by high quality protein, we mean that the vast majority of the calories from seafood is actually protein. So we're not getting the associated fats and trans fats that we might get from beef, for example. Okay, so we get really high quality protein. It's relatively low input in terms of fossil fuel usage and needing to cultivate land, etc. Okay, but if we're going to rely heavily on the ocean for food, okay, we need to recognize that the ocean, just like any other resource, is finite. All right, and because the ocean is actually not owned or maintained by any one nation, right? It's subjected to that concept of what we call the tragedy of the commons, which you guys should be familiar with by this point. Okay, and so there is not enough, at least large fish, I should say, to support the entire world's population. All right, so as a result, we're seeing this overharvesting. Okay, many species are at a point of severe depletion, maybe even what they call commercial extinction. Cod's a great example of that. It's one of the major fish that we use in our, a lot of our frozen fish foods are cod. Okay, and they're estimating that about 62% of the world's fish stock are in need of management of some sort, just because we're really concerned about those populations dying off enough that we can no longer rely on them. All right. Now, some of the ways, you might think of the oceans being so enormous and so vast, how could we possibly actually over-harvest these enormous fish populations? And a lot of that comes down to the fact that we've gotten so good at catching them. So this diagram here, and we'll do a little bit more of an intensive look at each of these practices in class, but we're using satellite tracking, spotter airplanes, and sonar, all right, to identify where these large schools of fish are. And then we have all kinds of drift nets, hook lines, long lines, trawl nets, purse seine nets, etc., that we use to just catch huge quantities of fish all at one time. All right, and in the process, it's when you're just throwing a net out to catch a bunch of fish, we do come across what are called bycatch, which are the unintended fatalities. So often with tuna fishing, for example, one of the biggest concerns is the catching of dolphins. All right, and dolphins, being mammals that are also air-breathing, right, we run into an issue of those dolphins actually drowning in the nets. All right, so one of the things you can actually look for on your tuna can, right? So you got your little can right there. There's a little picture somewhere that'll say "dolphin safe." All right, and what that means is they're using practices that limit, they probably don't entirely eliminate, but limit the number of dolphin fatalities associated with that. Okay, so that would be our tuna. Okay, But like I said, we'll look a little bit more detail at some of these practices in class as a group. All right. Now, we also have a lot of pollution that goes into the ocean. Again, because a lot of it's unregulated, there's a lot of just dumping of waste. Now, hopefully, I should say, not by U.S. Companies and whoever, but globally, there's a lot of just ocean pollution dumping ground. And interestingly, we get this big buildup of certain types of pollutants in our fish. So things like tuna and swordfish actually have really high concentrations of mercury in them. And that's because of a process called bioaccumulation and biomagnification, all right, which we will also address a little bit more in class, okay? And so they actually recommend to pregnant women especially to not eat tuna and swordfish because they're not quite at the toxic level, but it is worrisome because of its tendency to bioaccumulate. All right. All right. So as a result of some of these major concerns we have with overharvesting and so on, we have developed what's called aquaculture. All right. And so that's where we essentially farm fish and shellfish and lobster, etc. Okay, and so the way that would look is we still have to rely on seawater and saltwater, but this will be a shellfish farm, right? And in which case, rather than trying to harvest oysters, clams, etc. out in the wild, we actually farm them in large concentrations in what they call fish farms or aquaculture. Okay, and so this is important because it does help reduce the stress on the open ocean and our native populations. Okay, and so some of the environmental concerns about this, though, is whenever you're concentrating organisms, and organisms produce waste, right? We do have some water quality issues in the areas adjacent to our aquaculture areas. Okay. All right. Well, that sort of wrapped up our discussion for today. I apologize for all the background noise. I am actually in a public place trying to get this recorded, and I've gotten lots of fun little glances from people wondering why I'm talking to my computer. But anyways, I'll see you guys in class.